Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoy this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOCADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. Welcome to Season 4 of Momentum for Change. This is your host, Nora Mosby, and Momentum for Change is a monthly podcast brought to you by the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence to lift up voices of the Missouri movement. This is the first episode of Season 4, and I am very happy to get this season started with an important topic. Among many other things, January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And as many of our listeners know, human trafficking is an issue that intersects regularly with domestic and sexual violence. In fact, as we're going to be discussing during this episode, many domestic and sexual violence advocacy service providers are also providing services to survivors of human trafficking. So there truly is a lot to talk about today. In recognition of Human Trafficking Awareness Month, I am joined by two prominent voices of Missouri's anti-trafficking movement. We're joined by Jordan Campbell, the Coalition Director of the Missouri Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation, MOCATE, is what it's also referred to. And we are joined by Libby Trammel, the Communication Education Manager at MOCATE. Jordan and Libby, thank you so much for joining me today. As we're getting started with this episode, I'd love it if you all could just introduce yourselves and let us know a little bit more about what you do at MOCATE. Jordan, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, thank you for having us, Nora. Like Nora said, my name is Jordan Campbell. I'm the Coalition Director here with MOCATE. And some of my daily tasks are really just overseeing the coalition activities. And to highlight some of the things that the coalition does, we primarily have three different departments. So we have our advocate department, our dedicate department, and our educate department. And so within those three categories, we do some policy education. So you might see some policy briefings and different things for legislation, how to contact legislators, things like that. And then for our dedicate department, that's really a lot of our work groups and our committees and working with service providers and community members to address those resources that are available in the communities for survivors. And then our educate department with our lovely Libby, who will introduce herself and talk about her department a little bit more, is really around education and improving some of that knowledge around human trafficking and some of the unique aspects that are good for the community and service providers to know.
I love that framework that you just identified, Jordan. Do you mind just saying it one more time? Because I just thought it was beautiful and perfect.
Yeah, so our coalition has three different departments, and they are the advocate, dedicate, and educate department.
Love that. Libby, can you tell us more about what you do at the coalition?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Libby Trammel, and I am the Community Education Manager. So as Jordan said, I head up our Educate department. We do a lot of very exciting things. We provide training to identify, prevent, and serve survivors of human trafficking throughout the state of Missouri. So we do trainings both virtually and in person for any kind of group, whether it's professionals all the way to, I've had yoga classes reach out and want trainings. We truly are able to offer to any group of people. And then, as I said, we are statewide as well. So we've been all over the state of Missouri providing this kind of training and education. I am lucky enough to oversee those efforts, and I am also our main trainer at this time.
I love that. I also work for a statewide organization at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. And one of the things I love about this job is just getting to know all the different regions of the state of Missouri and visiting different parts of the state. It's really interesting. So I love to hear about people's origins in getting involved in anti-violence work. And so can you tell us a little bit more about how you got involved in MOCATE or in the movement to end human trafficking in general?
Certainly. So I began working in this field in my home state of South Dakota. I was working at a domestic violence shelter, and we were frequently having survivors of trafficking come through our shelter. We kind of realized we needed more training and understanding about these experiences. So I just really felt called to working with survivors of trafficking, and that's sort of how it began for me. I moved to Missouri about 7 years ago.
Awesome. Well, it's so interesting that you have that background in domestic and sexual violence advocacy, so you can really see the connections between these issues. I can't wait to talk more about that, Libby.
Yeah.
Jordan, how did you get involved?
Yeah, so, well, I first started at Children's Division. I'm from rural Missouri, so human trafficking is not an extremely prevalent topic, especially, several years ago in rural Missouri. And so I started my early professional journey with Children's Division. And that's when I was initially exposed to human trafficking. And I learned a little bit more about what that looks like with vulnerable youth. And so that started that passion and working towards, finding out what resources were available in the community. How can we better support survivors that were experiencing exploitation or trafficking? And then toward the later ends of my profession, I worked in FQHC. And so I got to see, some adults that were experiencing trafficking and exploitation in a whole new realm other than youth, and see really the prevalence of what that looked like in a different community than my own. And so later it led me to the coalition, and I've been working with the coalition and really been able to see the statewide impact that trafficking has on Missouri and all of the really lovely people that are working to address trafficking and exploitation in the state.
You all, I'm excited about this conversation already. I didn't know you had a background working with Children's Division. That's super helpful to know that you have that kind of understanding of systems and that you worked at a federally qualified health center and so have that passion for health equity. Well, I cannot wait to dive into this conversation, y'all. So, as we're getting started talking about the issue of human trafficking, I thought it would be helpful to just start off with a definition. So we have a common understanding of the terminology that we're going to be using today. So when we use the term human trafficking, what are we referring to? What are we talking about here?
Absolutely. So, human trafficking has a few different parts to that definition. If we start with the term sex trafficking, the definition of sex trafficking has two different components. So, sex trafficking is a commercial sex act involving adults while under force, fraud, or coercion, or any commercial sex act involving someone under 18. So I'm going to pause there and clarify that because that was a lot of words. When we say sex trafficking and we talk about commercial sex acts, that's any sexual activity for payment. So for adults, any sexual activity for payment while under force, fraud, or coercion. And for kids, people under 18, any sexual activity for payment. Full stop. If we're talking about children, there does not need to be force, fraud, or coercion present. So that's the definition of sex trafficking. But that's not the only kind of trafficking that we see in Missouri and in the US overall. The other piece is labor trafficking. And I'm going to read you the definition of labor trafficking. I'm going to clarify it. I always say it's got some old sounding words in it. So the labor trafficking definition is recruitment, harboring, transportation, obtaining, or any other way of accessing a person for labor or services while under force, fraud, or coercion. This can also include things like debt bondage, involuntary servitude, a few other terms people may have heard before. Again, it's a lot of words, but what it really breaks down to is if someone is being used for labor while under force, fraud, or coercion is maybe the easiest way to think about it.
Okay, that's super helpful. I appreciate that, Libby. Jordan, is there anything you'd add to that?
I think Libby did a really great job covering the definitions. Libby does a really great job. If anyone would like to hear that in a little bit more depth, she does offer the human trafficking, the basics course, as well as, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about what those definitions mean. And, a definition is great, but there are always some of the gray within those definitions that those additional training time does allow for more clarity.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when we're working with survivors, we're really talking about working with people often who have very complex lives. So there's often nuances to these situations. But I think starting off with just a common understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about trafficking is really helpful. And what I'm hearing is that there's this element of exploitation, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, it's people that are being exploited. So many of our listeners work at domestic and sexual violence advocacy organizations, and when they are serving survivors of human trafficking, sometimes survivors will say, I've experienced human trafficking, I've been exploited for work or for sex work in particular, but sometimes they don't identify it as that. And so, what are some common ways that survivors of human trafficking might talk about what they're experiencing or how they might identify what they're experiencing?
I really love how you frame that question because it is fairly rare that survivors of trafficking will come in and say, I'm being trafficked. That's not typically how advocates come across this. You may instead hear someone talking about, well, I have to reach a certain quota every night. So, what that can often look like is traffickers expect the people they're trafficking to bring in a certain amount of money or payment. So, they might say something like, go out and make me $500 tonight, don't come back until you do. And they use that as sort of a way to manipulate or objectify a person into bringing in a certain amount of money. So advocates might look for that, someone talking about that kind of quota language. Another way that you might want to look at this is some of the symptoms that survivors of trafficking may exhibit are similar to those that domestic violence and intimate partner violence survivors would experience, things like hypervigilance, for example. We also see a lot of memory loss, some of those sort of trauma symptoms. The memory loss piece is very common for folks with repeated trauma because the brain will suppress a lot of the really frightening memories in order to keep a person a little bit more regulated. So that's another common symptom that we see.
So really, symptoms that are common in people who've experienced other kinds of trauma as well. Is there anything
Yes.
else that you would suggest that advocates who work at domestic and sexual violence advocacy programs keep an eye out for, or something that might be an indication that someone is experiencing trafficking or has been trafficked?
Absolutely. And we'll talk a little bit more today about how these experiences can overlap. Something that I do think advocates in DV and IPV spaces can look out for is survivors of trafficking are often facing danger from multiple sources. So as they talk about their experiences, they may have a main person that they are having fearful feelings about or someone that they are facing the most risk from that you would term their trafficker, and they're typically facing violence from other sources as well, whether that is the Johns, which are the people who show up with the payment expecting to do sexual activity with someone. They may also be facing violence from other people who are being trafficked. And so when you're talking about how they may show up in these spaces, shelters, drop-in centers, whatever that looks like, you may hear them talking about multiple folks that they're concerned about.
That's such an interesting point. Thanks for speaking to that, Libby. I think that's really helpful. In the domestic violence advocacy movement, we often talk about perpetrator generated risks and life generated risks. And it sounds like that experience of trauma, trafficking, exploitation really is complex, and that there's perpetrator risk, but then additional levels from other people. So that's really important to know about. Thanks for speaking to that. Anything else you would add to that, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, we have a list of language and different things I would be happy to share with you. I think that some of the language that is utilized sometimes can be overlooked, and so just being really mindful and tuning in when you're having those conversations with individuals. What are those scenarios and different things that they're laying out within those conversations? Sometimes it is really hard for survivors to self-identify what's happening, and so as advocates, us really being mindful and listening to the, members or clients that we're working with. So that way, we can help them identify if that is something that is raising concern.
Yeah, and we can include the terminology in our show notes of this episode. So I think just having an understanding of the terms to listen for can be really helpful for advocates as well. So you all talked about how the trauma of experiencing human trafficking can impact a survivor's well-being, impact their mental health. I was wondering about other ways that survivors are impacted. Does it impact their housing or their economic well-being or maybe their relationships? But what are other ways that survivors are being impacted by human trafficking?
Yeah, so many survivors face fairly high levels of arrest and charges for things like prostitution, drug possession, loitering. And rather than being viewed as victims of exploitation, they're often facing criminalization. And having a criminal record can really limit access to things like housing, jobs, sometimes even college situations. And so all of those pieces serve then to further trap a trafficking survivor into that situation where their access to what choices they have get lower and lower with each criminal charge.
And as a point of advocacy, how can a service provider help someone who's experiencing that kind of criminalization as part of their victimization?
One thing that we do really advocate and educate about at the Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation is to build as many relationships with other providers as possible. And depending on your agency, that can include relationships with law enforcement. There may be certain detectives or other entities within those systems that you can build relationships with to kind of increase some of that knowledge base.
I can see how there could also be need and a way that training for law enforcement could really help with some of these barriers created by criminalization. Another point of advocacy, a primary role of advocates who work at domestic and sexual violence advocacy organizations is safety planning. So do you have any tips for advocates who are safety planning with people who've experienced human trafficking, given all these dynamics that you've already talked about?
Nora, I could talk about safety planning until the sun sets. I was a
I
case
bet you
manager,
can.
and it is a really important part of our jobs. Something that I've touched on a bit already, but can increase the complexity when you're safety planning with trafficking survivors is the many different sources of violence. So in a more maybe traditional domestic violence, intimate partner violence safety planning, it's usually one abuser that you're really trying to focus on. But the challenge with trafficking survivors is the danger can come from many different sources. And so it often creates a lot more complexity. Something else to touch on when we think about safety planning is what I often call internal risks. Survivors of trafficking are typically facing pretty high levels of substance use disorders, addictions, things like self harm and suicidal ideation. And all of those pieces should also be considered when we're talking about a holistic safety plan. I would say the process is just typically lengthier. It's going to take a lot longer than it might in, again, like a traditional IPV-DV setting. So this is often not a one-time conversation. When I've done safety planning with survivors, this is something we sit down and talk about frequently. And so for a lot of advocates, this is a repeat multiple day conversation. And like any good safety planning strategy, you revisit it. We tried this didn't work. We tried this idea of harm reduction. This wasn't super productive. Let's try this other harm reduction tactic, things like that. So sometimes it's sort of a throw things at the wall and see what sticks kind of thing. And ideally, you're being very collaborative with the client that you're serving as well.
I love that you just used the term harm reduction. I've often thought of harm reduction and safety planning as being very closely linked. But for any of our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with harm reduction, can you talk a little bit more about what that is that you're referring to?
Absolutely. So, harm reduction is anchored in this notion that human beings face a certain level of risk of harm every day. For example, it's very snowy outside in St. Louis right now. If I were to go get in my car and drive, driving inherently carries risk. Um, People engage in harm reduction every day without realizing it. When we put on our seatbelts when we're driving, that's an example of harm reduction. Driving carries a risk of harm. Seatbelts help mitigate that harm. If I were in an accident wearing my seatbelt, I might face less harm. But the harm reduction methodology is really is used a lot in safety planning because we're looking at people who are dealing with high levels of risk of harm. So what can we do to bring that down? So an example of that might be if we're talking about a client with really high levels of suicidal ideation, and we talk about hey, who can you call when you're feeling suicidal? What could you do to help reach out to people when you're feeling this way? Some of those pieces. Harm reduction can also be pretty involved in the substance use safety planning piece, things like Narcan, stuff like that.
Yeah, so it's recognizing the reality that there are risks that occur in life, but there are steps that we can take as advocates to help reduce those risks that survivors might be facing. Anything else y'all wanted to be sure to talk about when it comes to safety planning?
I think two words come to mind, and Libby, you definitely covered this, but self-determination and survivor autonomy. So just, like she said, collaborating with the survivor and really making sure within those safety plans that you're encouraging both survivor autonomy and their self-determination, and revisiting those safety plans with them, and exactly like Libby said, just collaborating throughout the entire process.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can certainly get on board with that, Jordan. That's great. So as advocates, we often have a toolbox full of resources to help survivors, to connect survivors with options. And so what are some good resources that advocates can put in their toolboxes when they are working with survivors of human trafficking? Anything that comes to mind?
I love to plug our resource guide. So our website, it's MOCATE.org, MOCATE.org. If you visit our website, if you're based here in Missouri or you're serving folks that are in Missouri, we have a comprehensive resource guide on our website. You can find everything from food pantries to legal services to therapy. It's really, I love that resource. And then if you're working outside of Missouri or serving folks in other places, the National Human Trafficking Hotline has a very easy to work database. I've actually used that resource for folks that were in Alaska, and I found resources for them. So I really, really love the National Human Trafficking Hotline as well.
Well, thanks for giving a shout out to those two things. We'll be sure to link those in our show notes as well. Any favorite resources you have, Jordan?
I love our Missouri resource guide as well. We added a few more little suggested clicks to help limit those searches that pop up on the search engine. So if you haven't looked in 2025 and seen some of those new little options at the top, I strongly encourage. One of my favorite things, when we think of the statewide resources, is you can search via the zip code. So I really like that. As case managers, we spend a lot of time on the phone or on the internet trying to find resources because there is such a lack of resources. So that is the thought behind the Missouri Resource Guide. Yes, you're still on the phone, yes, you're still on the internet, but hopefully it's going to limit the amount of calls that you are having to make. And it does allow for more specific searches. So if you're looking for services for family, hopefully you can click that little box at the top and you would be able to access the services specific and inclusive to family. So I love that. 211, there is a hold time, but I do utilize 211, but really strongly encouraging connection among service providers and having that network of service providers within your region, even outside your region, right, statewide, that you can give a call and they might be aware of new resources that are up and coming. So that way you can access those. There are a few new projects that we'll be releasing some information on. We're still kind of looking into them, but they do have some new legal services projects in the state that are trying to launch up. We encourage you to come to our work groups and committees, as every time we're aware of a new resource, we try to get that out through those networks.
As a fellow person who also works at a coalition, I 100% agree that we are stronger together, and there is so much benefit from connecting with other allied organizations to support survivors and really providing those comprehensive wraparound services. Another tool that I think of in addition to these kinds of resources that you've already talked about that exist in the community, it can be really helpful to know what kind of legislation exists out there that's helpful in supporting survivors of human trafficking. So when you think about either state or federal law, is there anything that comes to mind that you'd like to speak to as a helpful resource for survivors of human trafficking?
Yeah, so as for legislation, we're definitely hoping that we see more legislation passed in the future to support survivors and the network of service providers that are working toward providing those services. Two that we think about or come to mind, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That is a federal law. So if anyone's interested in that, they can definitely reach out to the coalition, and we'd be happy to provide some information in regards to that law and how that might impact a survivor or potentially even, impact some of the work that individuals are doing and what that information entails for your services.
I'd love to learn more about about MOCATE and the Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation. So can you tell us about your mission and anything more that you haven't already said about the work that you do?
Oh, I was just going to say we do offer membership in our coalition because coalition's in the name. Membership is open to agencies and to individuals, and it comes with a lot of really cool benefits. One of the ones that I am most excited about is our standards of care training. So MOCATE did a standards of care wave 1 publication that you can find on our website, and it essentially is a series of guiding principles for agencies that are serving trafficking survivors. It is a very cool document. Again, you can find it on our website, MOCATE.org. And if you are a member of our coalition, you get trainings on all 6 of our standards of care. And some of the titles of those trainings might sound a little familiar to advocates. We talk about trauma-informed care. We talk about survivor-centered care. But as the person who facilitates those trainings, I really love them. I think they're very cool and very pertinent to a lot of the work that agencies are doing. So that was my little plug about why people should be members, but I'll hand it over to Jordan to cover a little bit more about all the wonderful things that we do.
Yeah, so MOCATE, we vision a supportive and educated community. And so a lot of our mission is really supportive of that. Like Libby said, we have an educate department. We do offer free education that is both for the community, service providers, really anybody that would like us to come and do that education. So we have that both for human trafficking and then survivor identification. And then we have other trainings that's a little bit more specified into certain things, like best practices. We have some profession-specific training, and so those go more into what human trafficking might look like for specific professions. So we have healthcare, law enforcement, youth professionals, mental health. We have a specific one for hospitality, which was requested. We had some hospitals and different gas stations and things like that reach out. And so we did create a training for that based off of need. So if anyone is ever, identifying a gap or a professional area that could utilize a specialized training, we are happy to create those and offer those out into the community. We do statewide data collection. This is a fairly new project that the coalition has started. And so it is still in our pilot portion, but we do collect data from our members, and those data reports are found on our website. This is an effort really to further understand what trafficking in the state looks like. And so if you are currently tracking human trafficking data and you would like to share your human trafficking data with us, we would love to collect your data so that way we can really create that comprehensive image of what trafficking in Missouri looks like. And if you are not currently tracking survivor data, but you are currently serving trafficking survivors or potentially have the opportunity to, we would love to work with those providers as well to develop the ability to track that survivor data. We do have a list of things that would be great to track if you are serving survivors. So if you're interested, we'd love for anyone to reach out and we could help them with that project as well. And like we previously mentioned, our advocate department, we are definitely working on growing that department. It is our newest program, so it has not officially launched, but a lot of what we're doing right now under the advocate is policy education and relationship building with legislators. And so We have a needs assessment that we released, and within that information, that's something that we commonly share with legislators to really depict what the needs are in Missouri for trafficking survivors and help them understand, based off of the surveys we collected of service providers across the state, this is what we identified as a need. So hopefully that they'll take that right into their policy writing, and we will see some of those things addressed within some of the legislation that's being written, as well as it is a resource for the community. So if they're wanting to know who some of their local legislators are, or maybe an email template or something of that nature with some of that information that they can email out to their local legislators, that's something that we would absolutely love to support as well.
Well, hats off to you. That is many, many things, and I can see that you are staying very busy. So thanks for all that important work. I can remember a time when Missouri didn't have an anti-trafficking coalition at the statewide level. Can you tell us more about how MOCATE came to be and a little bit of the history of the organization?
Yeah, so MOCATE was not originally with Healing Action Network, but in about 2018, Healing Action Network was asked to take over the coalition, and so Healing Action Network took over what is now known as the Missouri Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation, and so they have been the parent agency of the coalition for working on 7 years now. So a couple years, right, in the making, and really helping MOCATE develop out those programs and support all of the statewide efforts that are going on right now. And there's a couple other, different regional coalitions and statewide efforts as well. But the originality is that it was a statewide effort, and it has maintained to be a statewide effort under Healing Action Network. And so we are thankful that Healing Action was able to become that parent agency and allow for the coalition to still operate and do some of those programs that were allowed to under Healing Action.
If anybody is not familiar with Healing Action, can you tell us a little bit about who they are, where they're at, what they do?
Yeah. Healing Action Network is based out of St. Louis. They also serve the Metro East side of St. Louis as well. So really close to that Illinois line. And Healing Action Network is really a agency that has 3 different programs within their umbrella. And so when I say programs, what I mean by that is the Coalition Against Trafficking and Exploitation, MOCATE, is one of those programs that is under the Healing Action Network umbrella. And then they have Volunteer Service Link, which is another program that is under that Healing Action Network umbrella. And then they have Center for Survivors, which is another program underneath that umbrella. And so Center for Survivors is the direct service provider within that Healing Action Network umbrella, and they provide trauma recovery services for survivors of trafficking, and more specifically for adult survivors. And then Volunteer Service Link, some people might be familiar, is the AmeriCorps program right now. And so anyone that might be having Public Health Corps, an AmeriCorps state, or a VISTA, that is something that is within that program.
I got it. Yeah. So would it be accurate to say that MOCATE is a program of Healing Action?
Yes, we are a program under the Healing Action Network umbrella.
And does MOCATE provide any direct services?
So MOCATE does not provide any direct services. Any direct service that would be provided under the Healing Action Network is going to be the Center for Survivors, which is located in St. Louis. But if you're okay with me sharing, Nora, I think something that might be causing a little bit of the confusion is the CCR telehealth project that MOCATE is facilitating essentially. And so I'd love to talk about that a little bit if you have time for that.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to hear about it.
Okay. So MOCATE does not provide direct service, but something that our membership had communicated was a need was statewide telehealth services. And that was something that came from our work groups and committees. And so that was something that we were looking at, trying to find a way to identify and meet a need within that gap. And so through Healing Action Network, they were able to write a grant which would allow MOCATE to lead a CCR telehealth project. This would be a statewide initiative in Missouri, and it's specifically designed to enhance support for survivors of trafficking and exploitation. This is for adult survivors at this time. And so through a multidisciplinary team approach, this project is going to help build a robust, coordinated community response and ultimately, hopefully, right, better support survivors across the state. So as a part of this effort, really what MOCATE is doing, we're going to pilot a statewide telehealth therapy service. And MOCATE's part will be to facilitate the service pipeline and essentially act as a linkage point between providers and survivors seeking services. So we will not be providing direct service, but we will be providing that service pipeline. So what that means is through our members that are seeking that referral, we will then we'll help them establish a referral network essentially. So we're just facilitating a service pipeline within the Center for Survivors direct therapy services that will be telehealth.
I can really see how a program like that would reach survivors of trafficking who are in rural areas that might not have access to other resources. So that's really exciting to hear about. Thanks for sharing that information. You all have talked a lot about some of the trainings that you do, which is such an important resource for us to know about. But I've also heard that you are launching a training soon around supporting young people and online abuse. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, so that training is now open to the public. It is our Human Trafficking and Online Safety, the Basics training. Essentially, we know that social media can be a double-edged sword, and youth today have unprecedented access to online media. And so what we are seeing is trends of traffickers using things like social media, online video game platforms, other pieces like that to really try to come at children. And so what this training looks at is the different tactics and strategies that we are seeing traffickers use, how to recognize those, and then tips on how to stay safe and some prevention pieces as well. So you can access that training on our website, MOCATE.org. It's free and open to the public. And so I've had quite a few caregivers, teachers, professionals that work with youth take that training and come away from it feeling like they gained some new insight on what some of those risk factors look like.
Sounds like you all have a just wealth of information on your website. So please, listeners, check out that website. It sounds like there's just tons of resources on there. Now that we've talked quite a bit about MOCATE, who you are, what you do, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about the anti-trafficking movement in general. I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of the origins of the movement and how you got to where you're at right now.
Certainly. So the origins of the human trafficking, the anti-trafficking movement, there's a few different ways you can kind of look at those foundations. Some of them are law enforcement based, others are sort of grassroots based. So you could sort of look at a few different pieces. When we look at Kate, for example, we have a few different guiding principles that we have kind of pulled from some of those origins that really try to guide the work that we do. And I'm happy to talk more about those.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to hear about it.
Absolutely. So one thing that Kate really tries to focus on, two components of survivor-centered care and trauma-informed care. And listeners may or may not be familiar with those frameworks, but those are two frameworks that we again and again in the course of the anti-trafficking movement are seen to be the most helpful ways to work with survivors of trafficking. Trauma-informed care, survivor-centered care, and then a few other pieces of this to look at at. One of them is when we talk about equity and inclusion. So human trafficking can occur across any demographic, and we know that it is disproportionately impacting marginalized populations. So for agencies and movements to be addressing trafficking, we cannot address trafficking without also addressing inequity. Things like racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ, bigotry, things like that. We also talk a lot, and Jordan and I have touched on it a little bit already, about how important collaboration is, and that's another big component of anti-trafficking work. It is impossible for one agency to meet every need that survivors have. The work is simply too large. And so Kate really takes a strong look at, what does collaboration look like? How can we work across these different sectors effectively?
Beautiful. Those are some great philosophies that actually sound very familiar to the anti-violence movement when it comes to supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Before we talk about more of those similarities, though, I do want to go back to the grassroots origins of the anti-trafficking movement that you talked about. So when you say grassroots, I really think about people who are being impacted by the issue, taking action to support other survivors. Can you tell us more about that? And is that what you're referring to when you say grassroots?
Absolutely. So, one of the tenets of trauma-informed care is peer support. And peer support looks at having people who have experienced these things being at the forefront of the care that's happening. So, peer support often looks like survivors themselves making policies, working with other survivors. And when we talk about survivor-centered approaches, that's also really important. So, agencies proactively seeking survivor-led changes, listening to survivor feedback, all of those pieces. Yeah.
So exciting. So in the process of kind of grassroots efforts, have you seen survivors starting their own organizations or starting their own kind of programs to support other survivors?
Absolutely. So, actually, the Healing Action Network was founded by Katie Rhodes, who is herself a survivor. And she has done so many wonderful things, including starting Healing Action Network. And we see that kind of survivor leadership in a few different places. Peer support specialists are a specific kind of professional license that people can seek in Missouri and other states as well, where they earn this license through a few different pieces I can talk about more if you like. But these are folks who have themselves lived experience. And peer support specialists aren't only survivors of trafficking, but can also be survivors of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, even things like homelessness. So there's a lot of ways that that peer support specialist piece can play out.
Mm-hmm. But certainly lends a level of understanding to the survivors that are, or to the services that are being provided.
Absolutely. And I think it's understandable that survivors often want services from other survivors. I think that makes a lot of sense. I know when I think about my life and the hard things that I've been through, I want people who understand that. And so we do see that being a big positive sort of across the board.
Wonderful. Well, I could talk all day about some of these origins. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we move on, though? Because I know we've got a lot of important stuff to talk about.
Jordan, did I miss anything you wanted to touch on?
No, I don't think so. Just highlighting that, yes, Nora, we are seeing agencies across the state that are growing their services, and agencies that are trying to get 501c3 status and different things like that. So hopefully we're going to see some new agencies in the state that are able to grow and continue that support for survivors.
Well, you all have talked a lot about some kind of guiding principles and values that are very similar to the movement to end domestic and sexual violence. But I know also you have some familiarity with the anti-violence movement when it comes to supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And so I was wondering, are there any differences you think that are important to speak to between the two movements? That would be good for listeners to just be aware of.
Absolutely. I know we've talked a lot about the similarities, and we can talk more about how power and control are present in many of these scenarios. One of the sort of concrete differences that we see is that when we're talking about trafficking, there's going to be some level of exploitation for some kind of payment. And payment doesn't always have to mean cash. It can really mean anything of value. So a person being exploited for housing, for drugs, for clothing, anything of value, typically that's going to be really your main difference between these experiences.
Awesome. Thanks for speaking to that. So many of MOCADSV member organizations are in fact residential programs. They're shelter organizations. And shelter is an interesting kind of service. There's never a dull moment in shelter, speaking as someone who's worked at a couple. And so could you tell us a little bit about what does providing services to survivors of human trafficking look like in a shelter setting?
Absolutely. So as I said before, I have also worked in a shelter setting. I'm very familiar with the ups and downs of that. And one of the really complex pieces that I'd like to encourage residential services to think critically about is how many rules they expect their clients to follow. Traffickers also set a lot of rules for the people that they are trafficking, and those rules are typically around things like curfew or some kind of behavioral expectation. And so when shelters have rules that might echo that, things like curfew, behavioral expectations, that can serve to set a survivor of trafficking up for failure. They may feel very activated. They may feel like this person is just trying to control me the same way my trafficker did. So I do encourage shelters to really examine the rules they're putting forth and examine the reasoning around that. Something that I think surprises folks to hear is that survivors of trafficking go back to their trafficker on average 7 times. And that's the same statistic that we see for domestic violence. And so I point that out when we talk about shelters, because I know shelters are seeing that behavior of returning and coming back and being in shelter, leaving back and forth. And that's going to happen as well with trafficking survivors. So I just wanted to make that clear because I think that can surprise folks.
Yeah, that's really important to talk about. Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about kind of that there are programs they're developing, but what specifically does the landscape of services for survivors of human trafficking look like throughout the state of Missouri? How would you describe that at this point in time?
Yeah, so things are getting better. We are seeing, as Jordan touched on, more and more agencies filing for that nonprofit status, but things are not where we would like to see them ideally. I know one of our biggest concerns we talk about a lot is housing. I think housing is a constant concern across many experiences, but definitely for survivors of trafficking. And we're especially concerned about housing in rural areas of Missouri. That continues to be a pretty big need that we are seeing.
So we've really talked. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Jordan.
Oh, I was going to say, I would just add, like a lot of areas for service, there are extensive wait lists. There are not enough services for those that are needing those services. And so there's definitely a need to continue to grow those services in the state of Missouri. Now, that being said, we are seeing them grow. And so with that growth, really just making sure that services are really supportive of what was mentioned previously, survivor-centered approach and trauma-informed. And we're really hopeful in the future that we're going to see that grow. And really, hopefully, the ideal is that we don't have a wait list and everyone that needs services will receive those services. But mental health is another service area, as well as housing, that we do still see a high need for services.
I don't know if y'all have an answer for this, but I want to throw it out there in case you do. Do you know, maybe even just a rough number, but how many organizations are in the state of Missouri whose primary purpose is just to serve survivors of human trafficking?
So I'm going to put a number out there, and it could absolutely not be the accurate number. But the number that I am aware of in the state of Missouri that their sole purpose is to provide services to trafficking survivors is 4. Now, that being said, there are other coalitions and agencies, like I said, trying to get their 501c3 status, and there are volunteer-led groups that do provide some services and referrals and things like that as well. But as for like registered 501c3s that I'm aware of, there are 4. Libby, are you aware of agencies outside of that?
No, I think you did identify that. One important maybe facet of that as well is that some of those agencies may only serve adults or may only serve children. So that adds maybe another level of complexity to the question.
Yeah, but certainly if you think about the state of Missouri, over 6 million people live in the state of Missouri, and there's only 4 direct service providers who are primary purpose there to serve survivors of human trafficking. You can see how there's a big need, there's a big gap in services. And so one of the ways that that gap is being met currently is that domestic and sexual violence advocacy organizations are serving survivors of human trafficking. And so that requires a level of collaboration, which you all have already talked about. So what's your vision for collaborating with survivors or with organizations whose primary purpose is to provide services to survivors of domestic and sexual violence? What would that look like?
For me, so much of that comes back to the passion that we hold for this work. You don't work in these fields unless it sets your soul on fire to do that. This ain't for wimps, as I might say. Like to tell people that we are very strongly invested in these fields for a lot of reasons. And so for me, when I think about that collaboration piece, it looks like putting our clients, our survivors first, and remembering that that is the core of the work that we do. The collaboration should be driven by, even if we might serve different populations, maybe, I mean, our populations are overlapping a lot, understanding that there's so much shared passion here, and that's a really powerful thing.
Beautifully said, Libby. So January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And so as we're thinking about January and recognizing the issue of human trafficking, are there any events that listeners can look forward to, or any ways that you are encouraging people to get involved for Human Trafficking Awareness Month?
One of the things I am really excited, and hopefully we'll see lots of participation on our social media. We're going to do a Wear Blue Day, and so on our social media posts, it's just, one day in January. I mean, I would encourage you, if you can wear blue every day in January, that would be amazing. But more realistically, there is going to be a Wear Blue Day on our social media that we would love to see the community, service providers, agencies really, post pictures of their blue if they're comfortable within those comment sections. If they would like to share them with Kate, we would love to share those as well on behalf of their agencies or them individually, just showing that awareness within wearing blue and supporting Human Trafficking Awareness Month. We will be releasing lots of information on social media regarding the awareness. And if you have any events, we would love to share those. Our viewers really like to know events within their area. And so if we have missed your agency and you are doing something, we would definitely like to get that on our website and our social media so the community or service providers would be able to participate in those activities.
Well, I hope it's a wonderful Human Trafficking Awareness Month this year. We've talked a lot about some of the dynamics of human trafficking, but when you think about the need for awareness, is there anything that really stands out to you that you think that there just needs to be more awareness around?
Absolutely. I think many times when I tell people what I do and I talk about human trafficking, folks might imagine that a van pulls up in the Target parking lot and they pull you in the van and they drive away and you never see your family again, and that's human trafficking. And while we know that those kinds of situations can occur, what we are far more commonly seeing is traffickers instead cultivating some kind of relationship with a person that builds into exploitation. The most common trafficker for adults is an intimate partner. And so a lot of the time, when we're talking about how trafficking starts, it starts with, very similarly to a domestic violence, intimate partner violence situation, a lot of affection, a lot of very quick sort of connection building, a lot of upfront love bombing that then turns into trafficking and exploitation as the relationship progresses. And I would say that's one piece that people maybe don't consider as often.
I'm so glad you said that, Libby. I think that's so important because we often see human trafficking as maybe a separate issue. But the reality is you're saying that oftentimes these relationships start off with an intimate partner. And so in many ways, these are not separate issues.
Absolutely. Someone can experience domestic violence and trafficking in the same situation. Absolutely. We do see that.
Interesting. Anything you wish there was more awareness on, Jordan?
The biggest thing that really is conversations around misconceptions, exactly what Libby said. There is a lot of different understanding across the state of what trafficking looks like and the reality of trafficking. And if we were able to really establish and provide some clarity around those misconceptions across the state, even the nation, of course, I could see that leading to a community that is better equipped to notice some of those risk factors of trafficking and just have a better understanding in a whole. This is the reality of what trafficking looks like. And, it's not always a violent crime, right? And it could look very different than what the average person might understand human trafficking. And so just a lot of clarity around human trafficking and exploitation.
Yes, and I can see how there's so many opportunities for the training that you all are providing to make such a huge positive difference. So thanks for all your work that you do every single day of the year to raise awareness on this issue, especially in the month of January, which is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. As we're wrapping up, you all, I want to say you have provided some deep insights, some really important points have been covered today. Is there any final thoughts you wanted to be sure to speak to as we are wrapping up this episode?
I have so loved our time today. I would say, I know we've plugged our website a bunch. We also have social media presence. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Please do give us a follow and a like. There's so many facets of this that we can't fit in a 1 hour podcast. So please do follow us and reach out if you're interested in trainings and learning more. There's so much to learn here for sure.
Thank you for speaking to that.
I think one of the things that I would note that, Libby and I don't think we specifically touched base on this. When we are talking about human trafficking services, yes, there might only be 4 that are directly providing services to human trafficking survivors, but we would not have the service network that we do without those that are not necessarily specifically supporting survivors, but also are including that in their services in addition to. And so just very grateful for all of those service providers that have or are willing to open up their services and expand those services to trafficking survivors. It absolutely is helping support survivors across the state, and just very appreciative. And if any of them would like to participate and become part of like the collaborative human trafficking network, we would love to see them at our work groups and committees and further understand what those services look like within their agencies.
Well, thank you so much, Jordan and Libby, for joining me on the podcast today. This has been such an enlightening conversation. It's been very helpful, and I really appreciate all that information that you shared. So thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We certainly appreciate your time as well. And please join us next month for another episode of Momentum for Change. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.